Hi, this is Shoshana Burgett from ColorKarma.com. I am here with Ryan Stanley, Senior Director of Color for PVH, Kristen Dettoni, the founder of Design Pool, a online licensable library. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, happy as always.
Thanks for having me.
Ryan and I typically banter on things of color and material and supply chains. We've been talking about color naming, Kristen. The pros and cons of giving it a name like avocado to giving it a number 12846B. From a design perspective, do you have a preference?
So I worked both ends. I worked at the manufacturers, which we love a good number. And then I've also dealt on the design end, which we love a good name. So I feel like there's always a happy medium of, I feel like everything I've had has like a name and a number.
Right.
And depending on who you're talking to, usually if you're talking to the mill, the manufacturer, they want that number. They don't want to hear the name. And if you're talking to a designer, they'd much prefer to hear the name. I think to your point with like the avocado, like certain names have certain color connotations. And so that's when I think it gets a little confusing when people get to tend a little too creative with the color naming. So that you can't really reference it like sneaker. You're like, okay, was that a pink sneaker, a black sneaker? So, but it does get challenging too, because I know with a lot of companies, they also don't want to repeat names. And so you have to start getting creative. But the funny thing is too, especially when I was working at the mills and you have a set amount of characters to fill for the name. So you'd have to get really creative. And some of them actually even, I think, got a little offensive when you started
truncating them.
Yes. They get to be like running jokes in the company. So
you take a nice long name and all of a sudden you truncate it and you have an inappropriate name.
Yes, exactly. You're like,
it's actually a really good point. One of the topics that's come up over and over when I worked at a color standards provider and now the past number of years at different brands is making sure that the names are politically correct, socially correct, to don't infringe or call out anything that might otherwise be disrespectful in any way, shape, or form. And names that we had typically called things in the past, I would think Chinese red is a really good example, right? People just calling out like the color of as they see it on the Chinese flag as an example.
Right.
Don't necessarily want to call it that, or something that continues to come up. I've seen at other brands too is, nude colors, calling a color nude, but knowing that we're all different colors, could potentially be disrespectful to some people. So making sure that you're calling out the right name for the particular instance.
But that's interesting because there's a fine line with that one, right? I mean, I could understand the China red, you gave an example. What if I said Chinese wedding? Because of the red dress.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the point, right?
Or white wedding. I mean, how do you start doing those types of things where something might be cultural?
You don't. I mean, that's kind of the more I see from conversations internally with PVH and externally with colleagues at other brands is, they don't want to touch those things with a 10-foot pole. So better to be safe than sorry, right? Like if it has even names that could potentially be misconstrued as aggressive, like calling a color fighter pilot blue. We don't want any reference to military equipment. No fighter pilot, no gun. Marine OD green. No reference to military or things like that.
So I couldn't do Trump orange.
Maybe, I don't know. He might like that. Yeah.
I will stay away from that one now. Park in that one. Kristen, what are some of the things you like to name when you're working with colors or names you've seen?
Oh, I feel like it gets challenging all the time, especially, and I think to the point too, it depends on whether it's an internal name or an external name. If it's an external name that's going along with someone's brand, I tend to, obviously you want to kind of stick with their brand and their naming tactics. And, I try and make it where it's obvious what the color is going to be.
Right.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I know, right? But then I also, I just end up doing like a lot of like website researches and seeing how other people like I look at a lot of paint companies because they have so many colors that they have to name. You know, and then you just Google like what things are brown, and then you get a whole list of things. What things are green, and you get a whole list of things that come up. So yeah, and then they have to be pronounceable too, which is another thing. Like there's some really cool names out there for colors, but like I still think I even mispronounce lichen, but a lot of like Lichen.
Like the
but a lot of people
liking it.
Yes, but a lot of people who aren't familiar with that name, you hear like lichen, you know. So there's a lot of. I try and make it as phonetic as possible. Let's put it that way.
That's interesting because one of the things that I had done in a previous role was I am about as uncreative as you can get. Right, I'm the numbers guy. I want to see data points, but I was tasked with having to name an exorbitant amount of colors. So I literally just went in and, you know, went to the dictionary, you know, downloaded all these adjectives, like something like 3,000 or 4,000 adjectives. And then I wrote a little macro that grabbed the color data so I knew what color family it was. So if it was a red, a green, a bright, dull, yellow, you know, whatever, and then married it randomly with an adjective. So you had an idea of what the color was, and it was connected to a generic random adjective to give it a bit of flair.
So but you sort of have to, because you run out of things after a while. So you can go through all the blues, like blue, lagoon, sky, pond, but then after a while you're like,
what else is blue?
What else is blue?
Lazy blue, yeah, like stylish blue. Like you have to. In fact, if you look at a lot of the paint companies, they end up doing that. Like they almost create like compound words because you run out of things.
And what about when you have a name and it's unclear what color it is?
Oh man.
So is clouds white, silver, gray?
Which then you just end up getting in like debates like this, like why would they name it that? That doesn't make any sense, you know?
Can you give us an example?
You know, even like things like lipstick. I mean, there's lots of different shades of lipstick. I mean, you assume red, but it's red, exactly.
Right.
But that's the thing is you assume it's red. So unless you have a visual to go with it, then that's where the confusion comes.
But with lipstick, they're trying to use emotional names. They tend not to use the color.
I think she was saying calling a color lipstick, and then you just assume that a color called lipstick is red.
Would be red.
Is that what you meant?
Yeah. So like the color name would be lipstick, and so you would assume that it's red. And that's where I said, like, people tend to get really creative, especially in textiles, because you're naming like the pattern, but then you're naming each individual colorway with the pattern. And so that's where, you know, maybe the patterns, I don't know, countryside. And then you're trying to think, okay, well, what colors are in the countryside that then relate to the pattern itself? So then you're like, okay, well, red, I could call it poppy. And then, you know, assuming that you assume that poppy is red, yellow, I can call it hay. But, you know, but then again, it's like, there's so many things out there already that have already been named. So when you're trying to stay creative, and then that's where things, I think things get a little funky. So it could be, you know, maybe the collection's called Metropolis, and, you know, one of the colors is called street. So you're like, well, is it black? Like, is it, you know, is that pavement?
Cement or concrete or or blacktop. One of the things that got me, or almost got me, I had to double check on was doing that, going just by the numbers, sorting everything out, marrying an adjective to a you know, a color family to get an idea of it. Making sure that when I broke apart all of my colors, I sorted them by the correct illuminant. So if a color flared in one direction or another, it potentially would have received a different color family, right? So like if under I'm making this up, daylight, it was, you know, casted one way, and under incandescent, it was casted another way. If I didn't export my data right and I accidentally exported it under the wrong illuminant, now, if the color did have a flare or was, you know, inconstant to some degree, I had to go back and check all my names. So making sure that I'm actually looking at them under the right lights too. That was a big thing for me.
For the naming convention.
Yeah, because again, you know, if what was that? What's that information or that little card that Pantone provides? You know, the colors that are inconstant, it'll flare from gray to purple or brown to green or khaki to red.
Stickers.
Exactly. If I exported it under the wrong light, it would call it it would put it in the orange family when it should have potentially put it in the red family, or it would put it in the navy family when it should have put it in the black family.
Right.
And now all of a sudden my name doesn't make sense, or you would think that it's one thing, but it's something completely different. So
from a design perspective, though, you want the names because you're talking to your clients, you're trying to pitch a whole idea. And like you said, countryside theme. You don't want to go, hi, this is color 1284 and 1286 and 122, right? But on the supplier side, they need the numbers. On the data side, they need the numbers. It's not easy to find or remember or anything else because it's that left brain, right brain of how their processes work. They have to read the data, they have to manage all the color tables, the spectral data, things of that nature. They don't care about the names. Is that similar to what your experience is, Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on who you're talking to. Like, again, typically designers, we like names. Like, it's just because it's easy to remember. Like, you're not going to remember a number. I mean, that's why, everything we buy has SKU numbers, but no one knows
You haven't met Ryan.
Number.
He remembers numbers.
But I do find it fascinating that you go to the extent of even looking at metamerism before naming, because again, from a manufacturing side, like we would always check our colors under different light sources, especially when I was working in automotive. It was so important because you're also matching to a lot of different materials within the car.
Yep.
But the average person doesn't pay any attention to that. And even the average, I would say, interior designer, I mean, when you're building out and grabbing your materials to, build out the room, you're usually looking at it with whatever lighting's in your office. So whether it's fluorescent or daylight so sometimes I do find it a little fascinating that we spent so much time getting the absolute perfect color when at the end of the day, like, I'm not even sure. I mean, I don't want anyone to take this in the wrong way, but I'm not even sure how much it really matters sometimes. It matters for like rematching. And obviously if you're trying to, if someone wants that same color 5 years from now or 20 years from now, that I totally get. But, to have like what really is like the perfect blue or the perfect red or the perfect yellow, like that, those conversations I find very fascinating. So.
And you have a customer, you have before COVID, you have a face-to-face meeting, you show them the colors and the color palette and things of that nature. If they leave with swatches and they take them home to show family, whatever, if change in lighting, all of a sudden, they're viewing it and they're going, that was, redder in the other one. And when I saw it earlier, perception in general, right? How I perceive color is different to you. So all of a sudden you and I can argue, is that really red or too orangey red? And
that's the conversation we had internally at PVH with design, making sure that all of the color names were relevant under our primary illuminant. So if they saw it, they knew that it was a navy, they knew that it was a red, they knew that it was an orange. If the color did happen to have flare, and then, Kristen, to your point, having all of the supportive information for execution, sort of that metadata kind of behind the scenes. So you're maybe placating is the wrong word, but I'll say it anyway. You're placating design by giving them a reasonably specific name under our primary illuminant. So that way, if they're looking at it under incandescent or working from home under daylight next to your window, at least they know or have that as sort of like a stake in the ground. Okay, it's navy. Like, it doesn't matter how it might look. Like, as far as the store light's concerned, it's considered navy. And then having all the background number information for anybody responsible for execution.
Who manages the quality for your customers?
It really just depends. I mean, I'm usually working directly with printers. So, they're the ones that are managing the quality from, receiving the file to me to really color matching what the customer wants. And then if they have to repeat it, like I said, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But also it's funny because I was just thinking about when we were talking about color and perceiving color is that, just even depending on the mood that you're in, like today, because it's like dreary. I mean, for me, it's dreary out and it's dark. So you tend to, look at color very differently, even if you were looking at under a spectrophotometer. And then from my days in automotive, we found that people are so much happier on Fridays than they are on Mondays. So if we really were trying
send them
to
samples on Friday.
Yes. Friday mornings. We'd always get an approval
I did
Friday.
the same
I shouldn't
thing.
say always, but a lot of the times we get an approval Friday morning because you're happy. And then the other thing too was that if you are the color specialist in the business and that's your job, is looking at colors every single day and matching colors, you kind of get a little bit of color fatigue they really only should be matching so many colors a day. So that was or looking at so many colors a day to make sure that, things were matching. So that was another interesting.
Well, you're 100% right. I remember doing a study where I would tell people women can see color better than men because a woman metabolizes the opsins in her eyes on average more efficiently than men do. So if I have to look at any shades of red or anything like that, I'll make an effort to look at them if I have to look at them visually, I'll make an effort to look at them in the morning versus in the afternoon, because you're exactly right. Eye fatigue. Like the longer you stare at a color, the longer you would be sitting in a light box. You have a propensity to see color differently. All the more reason why, just over the years, to Shoshana's point, I just became a numbers guy. Like I don't want to see the color anymore. Just give me, a reflectance string, and I'll just go off of that.
So well, and even sorry, Shoshana, I was going to say, even for me like when I was doing collections and choosing the color line, the final color line, I would lay it out on my desk, and then I would almost 3 days I would just live with it, and I'd wake up every morning and come down and be like, do I still like this? Do I want to swap it out? So because it really changes, but then you look at it long enough that it'd be nice to just even get a second set of eyes and just be like, okay, you just pick the blue. I've chosen two, and I can't even pick it at this point. So
I did a study once where we took a specific standard, and we found various objects of various materials that were, I'll say various one more time, different delta E's from the standard. And we went around with a light booth, and we asked the designers, we did this at Adobe Max several years ago, and asked the designers, say, here's your standard, and which one of these objects would you approve as a final approval? And it was fascinating, because you always had the one person who did want to approve anything in that light booth. Then you had the one person who would approve everything in the light booth, and there was a delta E of 5 in there. But what was interesting is how many designers didn't even use the light booth correctly.
Yeah.
They held the standards. They actually physically took a standard and the sample out of the light booth to look at it in the trade show lighting for approval. And it's just fascinating there's just not even a process of doing the visual sampling, right?
I think that's maybe just I've found, I don't want to call anybody out, but I think that would just be a general misunderstanding of process. Like, from talking with designers, Kristen, please tell me if you agree or disagree. What I've pretty much found is that they want to see it in the normal lighting, or what they would consider the normal lighting. And, for the most part, unless they've had the opportunity to be educated as to why they're using a light box, they almost see a light box as, again, just what I've seen, they've almost see a light box as constraining them, looking in one environment, as opposed to this is putting a stamp on how the color needs to be done. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
For
consistent
execution.
Source. And on top of it, you talked about your mood and it's rainy out. They didn't take the samples out. Not everyone. Some people actually knew the process. So let me be clear. So they would have all of these other colors in there really close together to the standard, to the one we were asking them for, and going through it one by one. So they were getting color noise, so to speak, right? Because they weren't just looking at the standard and the sample. How do you educate them, all of these designers of the value of looking under a consistent light and the process of, that visual? Removing measurements and spectral data, that is the best way. But let's start with the basics of viewing a sample to a standard in a consistent light source, right?
So, and my experience has always been that light boxes are always in manufacturing. I don't think I've ever been with a company that, or the person approving the color on the other end uses a light box. But outside of that manufacturing of color matching, color consistency, I would say most designers are usually looking at it in the source that they're going to be using it. So, the whole thing about them getting samples or being very a sample heavy industry is so that They can look at it in their lighting. They can take it over to their client's lighting. You can kind of look at it as the sun setting, because at the end of the day, none of us are living in a light box. So I would suspect that's why designers are. I don't know. I mean, if you were doing something that like, hey, this is the process. But I think on the day-to-day stuff, like I know that's what we're doing. But from a manufacturing standpoint, our heads were always in a light box.
Well, that's a good line to draw, right? Concept versus execution.
Thousands of designers, almost all of them don't have a light booth. It's too costly. It's too big. I don't need it. They go outside. Almost everyone says, I just go outside
Kristen
if I can.
made a good point, though, right? Like that's the line to draw. Like, is it design in regards to concept, figuring out what colors I like in relation to other colors, versus am I in an environment where I'm trying to reproduce it, or am I a designer that's receiving submissions to compare against a standard? And so I go to a light box, versus I just want to see if I even like this color. So I'm going to take it around with me and look at it everywhere where I might otherwise be. I think those are two different ways to, am I looking at a color and picking a color and seeing how they marry with other colors, or am I responsible for making sure it matches something else and coordinate with, like same color across different materials and things like that? Those are two different things a designer might do.
But to the earlier point of the different days or your moods or what you ate or drank or morning or afternoon, you're going to perceive that color differently that moment in time than you will the next moment in time. And then you have somebody in manufacturing who has a different experience, different perception, good day, bad day, Friday, Monday, and they're going to change. So you're playing red roses, and by the time you get to the final product, I've got purple roses.
Well, going back to the beginning, starting with color names, right? You're exactly right. On Monday, you're in a happy relationship and jealousy is green because that's just how it is. But then on Wednesday, you break up with your significant other and jealousy is red. So you might name a color something entirely different depending upon your mood too, or your perception of the name of the color might be entirely different depending upon your mood.
I think the biggest thing too is that, even your mood, even in a light box, even if you're looking in a light box, your mood is gonna, affect how you're perceiving that color. But I think for me, at least with my experience in all the years of the industry that I've been in, what it boils down to is just making sure that everyone is like looking at using the same light sources when they're color matching, and then having, your tolerance set as to what the standard is going forward. So if you had to rematch that, you know exactly what they're going to get. And I think if you asked any designer who wasn't in a position of being the colorist or color matching from a manufacturing standpoint, I don't even know if they would know half the terminology or half the terms that we're talking about right now. For me, I've been lucky because I've worked in manufacturing and I've worked at the textile mill. So,
I was going to say, hearing that from a designer, I want to give you a hug.
I know. Well, that's the thing. I feel like so many people, because I understand manufacturing, I understand the process. It's not an exact science. Like when you're doing a color sample versus color. So if you're doing a sample versus production, you're going to have a tolerance anyways between that sample and that production. Yep. So when people would be like, well, just go 2% more yellow. And
what does that mean? Yeah.
I know. And at the end of the day, I'm like, you're not even going to notice that in production. So it's like trying to get them to understand that. But then you also have, and I can appreciate this because I think I'm left brain and right brain and live both sides, is that, I appreciate you wanting it to be as perfect as possible. But at the end of the day, that's why I'm like, what is perfection? What's the perfect blue? Like, is it really worth spending that extra time, money, development time, and all that, when in the end, it's always going to be plus or minus something. And in the end,
agree with you.
Once it's out in the marketplace, I don't think the average consumer is going to be like, ooh, I love this toaster, but if this aqua had just been 5% more red, maybe I would have bought it. No one else thinks that way but us.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfection is the enemy of progress.
Yes, thank you.
But so there's 2 points there, Kristen, and one is spot on, is you worked on both sides. And I think that's really important. As designers, you have to go into production. Do an internship for a summer, but learn how it's made. Because if you don't know the process and you're just lobbing this volleyball over the fence, and you have more respect for that process. And quite frankly, I always believe once you know the process, you can actually become more creative because now you understand the technology of that. And the second point, Kristen, is I remember a printer who told me that their customer came and was arguing, can you get a little redder, a little this way, a little that way, off and on, and he lost it. He went out and bought their product off the shelf, came back and said, it matches from the first one I ran for you. What you just took me to doesn't match. Yeah. And it's like, it's finding that balance of that emotional to, this is what we agreed to now. This is a standard. We have to now measure to it. You can't introduce the emotions and perception once you have a defined standard.
Well, and the funny thing too is I remember from my automotive days, like I think we would submit, in some cases we'd be at, 26 different, and exactly
Holy
that.
moly.
2% more green, 1% more yellow. And then, it would never, I would say never fail, but a lot of the times when they had to finally make a decision, like, hey, this car's going into production, we have to make a decision, we got to get, stocking and all that, they'd pick the very first submit that we sent in.
Yeah.
They just wanted to see if it could get any better, so they were asking you and asking you.
Yeah, and sometimes that's okay. Like, I think it's fine. Like, people need, it's almost like sometimes psychologically you need choices, like you need options, because if the first one's perfect, then like, okay, that's weird. And I'm actually okay with that. There's a point though where it's like, okay, after the first 15, do you really need another, 30?
15.
Yeah,
see, that's where I agree and disagree. I agree in regards to uncuffed design. Let them see thousands of colors in any way, shape, or form prior to development of a standard, because it isn't defined. It's ambiguous at that point. It's an aesthetic reference. They don't really know what they want, right? So aesthetic reference, fine. Mess around as much as you want, 1%, 2%, because once that standard is defined, now it's a standard to be matched going forward. And at that point, then, that's just my opinion, remove yourself from the ambiguity and become objective. Like, now we know what we're matching. We know what illuminance it is. Step away, design, step away from execution, and be designers.
Right.
And trust that now that the standard has been defined, to define metrics, to define tolerances, that it will be executed within a reasonable production tolerance. But don't tweak it in production. Oh man, that would drive me insane.
No, well, and that's the line between the give it a name, give it a name, give it a name. Now we're in production, guys. It's a number, and we follow the number. Don't cross over that line and start tweaking it and adding it in there. You've passed that line. Now you're in QC, quality control.
Yeah, and I would say too, the other thing is, my experience is that those are two entirely different roles too. So it's like you have someone doing the design color approval on this side, but then once it hits manufacturing, it's almost like a whole other set of eyes are looking at it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good thing, because maybe it's like you've got the creative, and then you have, like you said, the person who's just like, okay, it's like, here's the tolerance. It's either it's either intolerance or out tolerance. So
yeah, to quote a leader here at PVH, I think he called it something along the lines of dredging the swamp, right? Having different team members sort of bleed into areas that they might not necessarily serve an interest in. So try to be more defined in those roles, defined in those lines. Like, yeah, you can have a say if you want to override it for whatever reason. If you get an SMS sample that you just love and doesn't match the color for whatever reason, fine. But now, if you picked that sample that didn't match the standard, you can't keep calling it that. It's something else now. Like, now it's, bubble blue 2.0, and then have it be referred to as something different going forward.
See, and I'd be like, bubble blue, wouldn't that be pink? Like, isn't, like, I think bubble gum?
Bubble gum is pink, but bubbles, it's water. It could be blue. Right? Or ocean bubbles, or
that's where it's just, I don't know. I just think naming things. I think I told you, Shoshana, the funniest thing for me when I first started was I so wanted to name a collection off of food, because I thought it'd be really funny to order, like, I'll have the meatballs with the side of peas and 10 yards of corn and
mustard belt, ketchup shoes.
Yeah.
So
needless to say, it didn't catch on.
Kristen, thank you so much for joining us today and
Thanks,
talking about
fun.
colors and bubble blue and avocado green and sky and all of them. But thank you very much.
Thanks,
This is Shoshana Brigette, Ryan Stanley, and Kristen Dettoni, colorkarma.com. Have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.